Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks for hosting us yet again at the Kirby Center. Um, it's always a good place to be, especially when we're launching something to try to reinvigorate the Constitution. Right underneath this beautiful portrait here makes this a perfect setting. And it was almost 4 months ago that we gathered right here underneath the same portrait to launch the Article 1 project, this network, this House and Senate network, an internal congressional think tank, if you will, working together on a new agenda of government reform and of congressional rehabilitation. The starting point for our agenda with the Article 1 project is the simple observation that the federal government is broken. It's not just that it's not functioning, it is functioning. It's just not functioning in the manner that it is supposed to function. It's not functioning in the manner in which it's supposed to function under its own rule book, established in 1787. Congressional weakness, deliberate weakness, is really to blame for all of this. It's at the heart of the fact that the federal government's not working in the manner that it's supposed to work. It's important not to conflate a broken federal government with an inoperative federal government. Likewise, we must be careful not to assume that congressional weakness is equivalent somehow to congressional innocence. A lot of the greatest constitutional misdeeds in this town occur not as a result of simply action, but also sometimes as a result of willful inaction. Indeed, the problem that we're here to address today, the problem of our hyperactive executive branch bureaucracy, writing upwards of 95% of federal laws without a single vote in Congress or without receiving a single vote at the ballot box, was primarily created by the legislative branch itself. It was created by members of Congress themselves for their own political convenience. So sometimes when you hear members of Congress talk about the aggressive federal regulatory system and the fact that we've got so many federal regulations coming out, they speak almost as if we were victims. We are not victims. We are the perpetrators. Congress created this problem. Congress must fix this problem if ever it is to be fixed. So at first glance, this may seem counterintuitive. After all, why would Congress willfully relinquish its legislative authority, given that that legislative authority is exclusively granted to Congress? In fact, the very first clause of the very first section of the very first article of the Constitution gives us that power. It says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. It makes clear that you cannot create law in the federal system without us. We must act. We are the ones who must legislate. We are the only ones given legislative power. And more to the point, if the lawmaking power is now being exercised, as it is, by the executive branch, if these lawmaking powers were not usurped by bureaucratic agents, why is it so common to hear members of Congress rail against the federal bureaucracy and accuse its rule-writing agencies of executive overreach? So this gets us to the difficult question of why. Why does this happen? To understand why members of Congress would intentionally empower federal bureaucrats to do the job, to cut the grass of Congress itself, to legislate for them, for the entire country. To understand that, we need to recognize that lawmaking is not just power. It's not just a prerogative. It's also a responsibility that comes with that power. In the animated video that many of us knew as children and came to know as children, we see that legislating is hard work. That's the lesson from that classic Schoolhouse Rock episode, I'm Just a Bill, which I should note for the young people in the room, you can view on YouTube. Even though it no longer airs with Saturday morning cartoons as I wish it did, it recently appeared on an episode of Saturday Night Live, albeit in a somewhat distorted form, explaining not bills but executive orders. That's also a very good video, but both of them can be viewed on YouTube. Now, in that video, a walking and talking legislative bills, sitting on the steps of Capitol Hill, just a block away from us, explains to a young boy how laws are made within the federal government, at least how laws are supposed to be made within the federal government. The process is long. The process amounts to what the cartoon describes as a long, long journey through Congress's parallel committee systems. And it involves a long, long wait as members of the House and members of the Senate amend the bill, debate the bill in order to build the consensus needed for a majority vote in both houses, and in order for them to have the opportunity to send it all along to the president, who can then either sign the bill into law or veto it. Of course, they don't cover the other option, which is to allow it to pass into law silently without signature, but that's okay. Nor do they cover the pocket veto, but I think that can be a next episode of Schoolhouse Rock once we reinvigorate that trend. Zeroing in on the moral of the story, the boy finally asks, "It's not easy to become a law, is it? Not an easy process." No, it's not, nor should we expect it to be. There are 535 members of Congress, representing some 318 million Americans living in thousands of communities across 50 sovereign states in our country. It's not easy for a group that large and that diverse to agree on anything, let alone what the nation's laws should be, let alone the composition of a rule to which every American will be subject. Legislating isn't just difficult and time-consuming, it's also risky. It is politically risky for those involved in the process, and it is unavoidably necessarily so. In the sense that if after all that work, you're a member of Congress and your constituents dislike the legislation that you wrote or that you supported or that you even voted for, they may vote you out of office the next time they get the chance if they don't like that legislation. Now, over the past century, primarily over the last 80 years, successive generations of elected policymakers in Congress, and I would add here members of Congress in Congresses of every conceivable partisan combination, have sought to escape those risks and have sought to escape the political accountability that goes along necessarily with those risks by writing laws containing broad statements. So they try to avoid the process and the risks that go along with the process by writing these broad standards and then issuing a broad mandate to an outside entity, a federal bureaucracy, to come up with their own rules carrying the force of law that will then take effect without further congressional action and without any additional congressional accountability. They just delegate to the executive branch the power to determine all of the specifics. And of course, the specifics are where the details are. The specifics are where the risks are. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. used to say that there is a point of contact in every case. And he said that the point of contact is defined as the place where the boy got his finger caught in the machinery. And I would add here that there is a point of contact in almost every piece of legislation. And that point of contact is often defined as the place where the lawmaker got in trouble with the lawmaker's constituents. That's just what happens when you make real laws, when you actually make a difference, when you impose rules on the American people. It is supposed to be risky. It is unavoidably risky. But it is us as members of Congress who are supposed to bear those risks because we're supposed to make the laws. For the rule-writing bureaucrats, these open-ended, platitudinous laws are gifts that keep on giving. For instance, in the years since Congress first passed the Clean Air Act of 1977, federal bureaucrats have used the law to enact more than 13,500 pages of regulations, roughly 30 pages for every page of legislative text. But for the American people, this kind of government without consent, regardless of the outcome, regardless of whatever positive implications might be brought, regardless of whatever positive outcomes that might be brought about by the regulations, These are things that insulate lawmakers from their constituents, and these are things that make the government ultimately less accountable. This kind of government without consent is a violation of the social compact that is at the heart of our constitutional republic, and is exactly why so many voters no longer trust the federal government, because they feel like they have no say in it, because in many, many cases they don't, because in many, many cases the laws by which they are governed are written by people not of their own choosing. They're written by people who don't work for the people, they can't be fired by the people, they never stand for election, and they're not really even accountable in any direct sort of way to anyone who is elected by the people. So we've got to earn back the American people's trust. And earning back their trust is the chief objective of the Article 1 project's agenda to re-empower Congress, and it's why we are today introducing the Article 1 Regulatory Budget Act, a bill that will put the legislative branch back in charge of the federal regulatory state, and by extension, to put the American people back in charge of Washington. I'll let my colleagues dig into the details of the legislation. I look forward to the input of the esteemed panelists that we'll hear from later this morning. If you're interested in learning more about this reform and about the ideas behind it, I'd encourage you to pick up a copy of the A1P policy brief, Leashing Leviathan, the case for a congressional regulatory budget. It's now my privilege to hand over the podium to my friend and Article 1 project partner, Congressman Jeb Hensarling from Texas. Thank you.